So this is our first exam question. It says, in the following passage, each numbered space can be filled with a biological term. Write the correct biological term beside each number below that matches the space in the passage. Now, in recent papers, they've started adding these sorts of questions in quite a lot. There was one added in last year's paper, and I think it was on respiration. There was one added in the year before, and that was this question, and there was another one added in the year before. So 3 years in a trot, they have used questions like this in terms of filling the blank questions. Okay, so again, I think it was asked in paper 3 or paper 2 in our last year's paper. However, it is something that can definitely be asked as well. Okay, in fact, they've started to include these questions in quite a lot. So it's worth 3 marks. I'll give you guys a couple of minutes to have an attempt at it, and then I'll start going through the answers in about a minute or so. Okay. So I'm going to start going through the answers. So it says each type of cell has specific molecules on it, something that identify it. So what does each cell have on its surface? Well, it has, where are the specific molecules present? They are present on the cell membrane of the cell. So the first option would be cell membrane. Then it says an antibody is what with two what binding sites. Okay, so we know that an antibody, we've looked at the definition for it. We know an antibody is a protein with two what binding sites. Remember, we saw that an antibody has a quaternary structure, which means that it's made out of 4 polysaccharide chains. It has two variable regions at the top, and those two variable regions are where the antigens bind. So it has two antigen binding sites. Antibodies are made and released by what cells? What cells release antibodies? It's the plasma cells. Remember, plasma cells release antibodies, and memory cells differentiate into antibodies when infected with the same pathogen in the future. Okay, so plasma cells is the answer. And then vaccines can provide protection for individuals and populations against disease. The response to a vaccine is an example of what immunity? So a vaccine, remember, it's an example of active immunity. A dead or inactive form of a pathogen is injected into your body, and your body actively produces antibodies against it. So it's an example of active immunity. And then something immunity occurs when a large proportion of the population becomes immune to a disease, and that is what herd immunity is. So we would just try herd immunity, and that would be worth 3 marks. Okay, as you can see, 6 correct, you get 3 marks, 4 to 5 correct, 2 marks, 2 to 3 correct, 1 mark. Okay, then as I mentioned, we have a 5 marker on describe the difference between the active and passive immunity. Now, again, this is a common exam question. It doesn't normally come up as a 5 marker. This is the sort of like one-time question that has come up in terms of a 5 marker. It normally comes up as a 2 or 3 marker in an exam, but it's a very common question that can come up. So if we have a look at the mock scheme, this is basically what it says. And these are the points that you need to be aware of. So describe the difference between active and passive immunity. Active and passive immunity. Active involves memory cells, passive does not. Passive means that the antibodies are just introduced into your body. Active involves memory cells because the memory cells have been produced in the body. Active involves the production of antibody by plasma cells or memory cells. Again, it's the point that passive is just the passing of antibodies within your body. Passive involves antibody introduced into the body from outside or main source. Again, it's literally just comparing active and passive against each other. Active immunity is long term because antibodies produced in response to an antigen. Remember, in active immunity, your body is working to create the antigen, the antibodies itself, which means long term immunity can be formed. Passive immunity is short term. The reason why short term is because the antibody is broken down. If the antibody has been introduced, the antibody will have its effect and then it will break down after its effect. So long term immunity is not being formed. And then in active immunity, it can take time to develop, whereas with passive immunity, it is fast acting. When you just pass the antibodies in, the antibodies can do their work and then be broken down. Done. Okay, so if you have any sort of dangerous fatal disease, passive immunity can take place, antibodies can be injected, they can do their job and be broken down. Okay, whereas in active immunity, it takes a while for their immunity to develop. Okay, so any of those 6 points, you only need 5 of them to get 5 marks. Okay, again, the reason why I've put this question up is just to make sure that you have a wide bank of points in your notes. So if you get asked a question like this again, which is very likely to come up, you know exactly which points to pick up from. Okay, so moving on to our next question. This time we've got a read the passage question. Okay, so I'll give you guys a couple of minutes to have a read of it, and then I'll start going through the answers. Again, this is about um, herd immunity, this question. Okay, so if I start going through it, so it says read the following passage, and then it says suggest how vaccinating as many babies as possible protects the UK population against pathogens such as measles virus and tetanus bacteria. Now, the key part of this question, one is a virus, measles virus, and one is a bacteria, tetanus bacteria, lines 9 to 11. Okay, and we need to see how vaccinating will protect the UK population. So it says over here, the UK immunization program vaccinates as many babies as possible to protect the UK population against pathogens such as measles, viruses, and tetanus bacteria. That's what the UK immunization program does. It says measles viruses spread quickly from infected people, and that's what lines 9 to 11 say. So how does it form protection against measles? So we know that measles spreads quickly between infected people. So if you vaccinate babies, that means herd immunity can be achieved. Okay, herd immunity can be achieved, which means that this will reduce the spread of the measles virus within the population. So herd immunity can be achieved which reduces the spread of the measles pathogen within the population. And then it says protection against tetanus. Okay, now if we think about tetanus, let's have a read. It doesn't really say anything about tetanus, but we know that tetanus is a bacteria, and it says over here tetanus bacteria enters the body through skin wounds, and it does not spread from infected people. Now, although this question said lines 9 to 11, you needed to have an understanding of the whole text in order to answer the question. Okay. Um, so it doesn't spread between infected people, which means that it doesn't really provide herd immunity, because herd immunity is only there for infections which can pass between populations. It can spread between infected people, like COVID, for example. Tetanus doesn't spread through infected people. It spreads through um, skin wounds. Okay, so vaccination doesn't provide herd immunity. Okay, it doesn't provide um, herd immunity in terms of tetanus, because tetanus is not spread through um, infected people. Okay, it spreads through skin wounds. Okay, so it doesn't provide herd immunity. So vaccination, in fact, um, is not really going to provide protection against tetanus, because tetanus is only going to protect that individual once he's been vaccinated. So the key concept over here is that no herd immunity is formed. Only the vaccinated individual will be safe. Everyone else will still be at risk. Okay, and that's what I would say for a question like this for 2 marks. So if I show you the mark scheme for this question, it says against measles, to achieve herd immunity to reduce spread. That's the point of vaccinating against measles. And for tetanus, no herd immunity is formed because you're comparing from measles to tetanus. It only protects the individual. Skin wounds are common in children. Okay, so that's what you needed to say for the 2 marks there. And then we've got our final question over here, and this is the venomous snake example that I was giving you. So it says when a person is bitten by a venomous snake, the snake injects a toxin into the person. Antivenom is injected as treatment. Antivenom contains antibodies against the snake toxin. This treatment is an example of passive immunity. Explain how the treatment with antivenom works and why it is essential to use passive immunity rather than active immunity. This is an application question. However, it's a very common application question. You could get asked the same question with a different context. So it's really important to understand why the answer is the answer in this question. So as I said before, passive immunity, the antibodies are passed into your body. They will destroy the pathogen or the antigens from the pathogen, and the antibodies themselves will be destroyed after. Okay, as you can see, it's faster, it's to the point at the exact moment. Whereas active immunity, your body produces the antibodies themselves. So it takes time to produce those antibodies. And that's exactly what you have to say. So if we have a look at the mark scheme, it says antivenom or passive immunity. Antibodies bind to the toxic antigen and cause its destruction. So the antibodies that are passed in via the passive immunity form, they will bind to the toxin or the venom, and then they will destroy it. And then once that has happened, the antibody will be destroyed. If we used active immunity instead of passive immunity, then the active immunity would be too slow, because active immunity will need to produce the antibodies itself. Okay, it can't sort of rely on other antibodies like passive immunity does. Okay, so in this case, passive immunity is more important, so you can get rid of the venom that is present within the person.